Alrighty. Hi guys, we're Presence. We're one of the pitch projects this semester. We're making a branching narrative game for VR. This is our team of 4. You're going to get to know us and our roles throughout the presentation. Our instructors are Chris and Brenda, and my name is Melissa. I'm the producer on the team. To go through our presentation today, we're going to begin by talking about what we're trying to explore, after which we'll go through the process by which we're exploring it, and we'll conclude by talking about how we're testing to measure our success. To go into our design question, what we wanted to explore this semester is the following: how to translate the successes of third-person branching narrative games into VR. Third-person branching narrative games are games where the player is the narrator. So usually the player will play anywhere from 2 to 8 characters from a removed perspective, making choices on behalf of those characters to manipulate the story as a whole. These include games like Supermassive's Until Dawn, Telltale's Tales from the Borderlands, and Quantic Dream's Heavy Rain. Now, moving into VR, the general inclination is to switch toward first-person games where the player plays as an actual main character, and this is because when you put on the headset, you're suddenly in the scene. Now, the thing is, from a design perspective, this forces the writers to make a decision about how complex they want the characters to be. If it's too detailed, you run into the issue of a dissonance between the player's emotional journey and the character's emotional journey, which doesn't quite work. And if you give very little character definition, you lose the ability to use complex characters as a narrative tool, which is unfortunate as well. So we are exploring a third option, the third-person option, where the player is completely removed. Now, doing this in VR does pose a major challenge, that being the idea of voyeurism and control. Voyeurism being watching something that's happening in front of you while being removed from it, and control being the sense of having the ability to manipulate the situation. This is easily achieved with screen-based games because there's a literal wall between the player and the characters, but in VR, the situation completely changes. So, in order to explore this, we are making a game in order to figure out how to do it. Through our building process, we're going to be iterating and exploring and testing, and ultimately, as we learn, we're producing a design document which we'll be passing along to future developers in this area. In order to do this, as we go through our design process, you're actually going to see us borrowing a lot of language from film, video games, and theater, since VR tends to exist in the center of these 3 things. Now let's take you through our design process.
Hi everyone, I'm Brad and I'm the narrative designer on the team. So let's start talking about what we're building. We are building an 8-minute narrative virtual reality game for the HTC Vive that takes players through a single story told over a single scene in a single room, 10 foot by 10 foot, like the Vive space. The player takes on the role of sort of an invisible figure, unseen by the characters in the story, instead observing them from the same room, only able to affect the narrative by interacting with the environment around them instead of directly with the characters themselves. Our design breaks into 3 major components: the narrative, the art, and the interaction, and now we're going to take you through each one of those one by one. So let's start with the narrative. We knew from the beginning that we needed to drape our story decisions around the idea of choice, as player choice was going to play a critical role in our design. So we came up with 3 design principles for our choices. 1, we wanted our choices to be clear, in the sense that it was obvious when a choice was being made and what that choice was. Secondly, we wanted the choices to be personal, in the sense that we didn't feel like we were directing players towards one choice or another, or that one was right or wrong. Instead, the choices were internally motivated. And then thirdly, that the choices were meaningful, in the sense that immediately upon making one, it was obvious and apparent what the choice was that you made. Our story goals, we borrowed from Telltale Games writers, Telltale Games being one of the leaders in this industry. They say that their stories are all about choices and relationships. So we borrowed that and thought about choices first. We wanted our story to have clear, high-stakes objectives, which is where we got the notion of film noir, a genre that generally lives in that world. And then when it came to relationships, we knew that we needed to define these other characters as compelling and complicated and interesting, having unique relationships with each other. So what is our plot? Well, our story is about 2 mobsters who return to their hideout after a failed bank heist with the cops hot on their tail. And while trying to figure out how they're going to get out, one of them, complications arise because one of them realizes the other one may not be telling the whole truth. In terms of our main design document for our story, we have this thing we've called the node tree, which has gone through many iterations over the course of the semester. This design document tracks all the different possible parts of the story that a player may encounter in their experience. Each one of these squares represents a bite of story, a chunk of story that the player may or may not see, depending on the decisions in the environment that they make. Every single one of these lines represents one of those decisions being made. So, depending on the choices that a player makes, they go through different paths in the story, totaling 32 possible ways they can go through the story and 10 different endings. An example of one of these, just to give you an idea, in node 2A, we have one character trying to make a phone call. Whether or not the player has decided to disconnect the phone line in the room or let the call go through changes whether that character is able to make the phone call, thereby branching the story in one direction or another, having ripple effects down the line. From the beginning of the semester, we've been working very closely with two actors from the School of Drama, Ramsey Pack and Zach Herman, who in many ways have been the 5th and 6th members of the team, helping us craft the characters' voices as well as body language. They've been really critical in building those things as not only a tool for iterating the story itself, but also the fact that when we ultimately move to motion capture, we're going to lose a lot of their faces, so their body language and voice was very important. Directing with them has been an interesting challenge of using tools from traditional theatrical workshopping, as well as understanding the needs of game design and virtual reality design. An example of one of these is how we've blocked the scene. Despite the fact that our story takes place between only 2 characters and they are the only actors in the room, we've had to block the scene as if it was a 3-person story because the player is in the physical space with them. So in many ways, we've been creating pictures and triangles, always consciously aware of where the player is in the directing process with the 2 actors. On top of all of that, we've had to be aware of the fact that the animation process is coming down the pipeline so that we didn't have the actors do any sort of motions or actions that would cause undue stress when animation time came. So, speaking of the art, Sharon.
Hi, I'm Sharon. I'm the art director and 3D artist in the team. So since we know that motion capture will bring us a huge challenge, we were very aware of striking the balance between stylized as well as realistic style when we design our characters. The first thing we did was to get measurements from our actors and build the concept art based on that. Also, we want to have a reasonable scope, but we also want to have the emotional expression from our 2 character models. So we designed our 2 characters in a simple but distinguishable way. From there, we came up with the idea of silhouette. For one thing, it is well fitted with the film noir style. For another thing, it means that we don't need to mess up with the complicated face modeling or the facial animations, but at the same time, which means that our 2 actors worked really hard on the body language to convey the motivations. So talk about film noir, it is the style that is identified by the direct harsh lighting, dramatic contrast, as well as the harsh shadow. With all these elements combined, it has the great power to create emotions as well as drama. That's why we refer to it as our art style. So move to the environment. Similarly, we wanted to make the motion capture easier. So we really took the actual size of the room as well as each object into consideration when we built the environment. Also, we wanted to keep the distinct time period. So we modeled all the objects based on the reference from the exact year we set, which is 1944. To make the environment more like film noir, we know that lighting plays a big role. So we finished our first draft of lighting with all the untextured objects to get the sense of feeling. For the next half of semester, we will spend more time iterating on lighting using textures to add more details and contrasts. So next, let's talk about player interaction.
Okay, hi, I'm Zoe. I'm the programmer on the team. So the next step is to add interactions to the environment. From flat-screen, third-person narrative games, we noticed that most of them are using floating text and icons for the players to make choices. And we know that this won't work well in VR. That's why we decided to incorporate these choices into the objects in the environment. And we noticed from playtests that in VR, players tend to mess around with everything. So we limited the number of interactable objects into 5. And we don't want to make the interactions too complicated, which will distract the player from the narrative. So all the objects only have two states. For example, here, the gun is either empty or loaded, and the window blinds are closed or open. And we still have many design questions to be answered. The first is, how does player interact with the objects? Currently, we are using the direct touch and click mechanics, but we could also use real-life physical mechanics or line of sight, point and touch. And secondly, when does player interact with the objects? Currently, we made all the interactable objects available in the beginning. And we're also considering making them available one by one or making multiple objects available at once. And thirdly, how do we signal the player about how and when to interact? So now we are using flashing light to indicate that the object is going to be locked in soon. And we are also considering using special effects to deal with it. And of course, we are always exploring the big question for all the VR projects, that is, who is the player? To find a solution, we went to immersive theater and played relevant games. Through these activities, we are trying to design our threshold for the experience to contextualize it and make it smooth and complete.
So as you can see, at this point in the semester, the work on building our narrative is effectively done as we've completed our motion capture and moved towards going to voiceover. Our art is in progress as we begin to get that motion capture data back and begin to polish that environment that you saw. And now that we've moved into virtual reality, we're going to begin exploring interaction more heavily. Let's talk a little bit about playtesting. We've broken our playtesting period of the semester into 5 major phases, each one focused on a different portion of what we needed to test at the time and what that type of playtest would be good at telling us. We began with table reads. Once we finished the first version of the script, this was really informative for us as it told us about general comprehension of the story, as well as sort of the flow of when those choices came into play and how they interacted with that narrative. Then we moved into brown box testing, where we got to actually stand up and do a live recreation of what our virtual reality game would be, which was really interesting as it taught us a lot about how people interacted with the story when also asked to be in the physical space moving around. This is actually where we got that sort of 3-person directing that I was talking about earlier. And then just last week we moved into live VR testing, similar to Brown Box with 2 actors controlling the characters, but instead of it being live with cardboard and real physical objects, the actors were puppeting virtual reality characters and our playtesters were actually in the headset. This was really informative as it taught us how players reacted now that they were in virtual reality and how that changed their perception of the events. Of course, now that we are getting motion capture data back, we're going to be moving towards a fully digital version with rough drafts of the animations, which is ultimately what we'll be testing at Playtest Day in about 2 weeks.
So taking us into the rest of the semester, the one thing that we're very aware of is the following set of risk and challenges, which are, we have no idea what's coming. That has been reiterated by faculty, it's been reiterated by previous projects and experts in the field, and so that is why we are so heavily stressing getting into VR, play testing repeatedly, and why when we look at the rest of the semester, as you'll see in the top line, iteration is a huge part of how we're going from week 10 to week 15. And in addition, as we go through, like I said earlier in the presentation, documentation is going to be essential. And so as we iterate and as we create new versions of the game, we will be documenting what we've learned and creating this final deliverable of a lessons learned design document. In conclusion, we are Presence. We are creating a branching narrative game for VR, and we're happy to take your questions at this time.
Thank you.
John?
So you mentioned about blocking all 3 people. So you're moving the user around the room, is that correct?
That is correct. We are moving the user around the room.
No. Sorry.
Wait, yes.
The player is free to move about the space because they're in the Vive. We wanted to anticipate where the player might move as a result of our blocking, so we were consciously aware of if the actors are in this space, where would the player feel most comfortable? We are not making any choices about where they're standing. They can stand wherever they want to. We're hoping to anticipate that, though.
Are the actors aware of the user at any given time?
No, they are not. They will not be responding to the player at all.
So what you're presenting now seems very close to what you began the semester with. I'm curious to know if there have been any surprises that have led to changes over the course of the semester.
Well, I think some of the biggest things that we've found are actually in terms of narrative, and Brad can talk more about that. A lot of what we've been discovering has to do with how we create a balanced story as things branch to make sure that no matter which route you go down, you feel like you made impactful choices, which is harder to telegraph than I think we'd initially anticipated. And then also make sure that no matter which route you take, no matter how different the experience is, you still feel like you had a good experience.
Yeah, a lot of the iteration and sort of change when it comes to the interactions themselves is going to come in this latter half now that we're actually in virtual reality. I think it's hard to tell from this presentation, but the story went through like 5 or 6 different drafts, each one with playtest. A huge thing was actually, if you look, oh my God, am I gonna be able to go back that far?
I'm gonna go and actually exit out and go to the front.
Okay, if you go to that node diagram and you look at the first, the ladder, there's an interesting thing, like as an example of one major change that we made. Go to the first one, yeah. So if you look at this one here, there's lots of things like here where we go back and then we come back together, and we found like that is not a feasible design choice. People hated that. So if you look now at this one, it never does that to the same way. And so lots of little things like that with the story is mainly where we've iterated in the first half of the semester.
Is that a question in the back there?
So you mentioned choices are meaningful in this game, right?
Yes.
So in practice, say I lock the door, but I don't really know what does that means to the story if it's the first time I play the story. I don't really know what my actions means. The whole game feels to me is like a trial and error game. Like, you figure out what each interaction means to the story.
Yeah, so in terms of our design pillar of meaningful choices, there's both a short-term and a long-term sort of meaning to that. For the short term, every individual choice is immediately apparent. Going back here, one thing that we had is we have this coat rack, which is an object no longer in the game. When you made that decision, there was almost no change to the narrative right away when that locked in, so it was difficult to tell right away what that did. Now, in this version, every single thing has an immediate and obvious effect, like a drawer being locked. If a character can't open it, it's very clear that that's going to change the story. The coat rack we thought would be successful because it has long-term implications in the narrative, but those didn't become clear because there was no short-term. So now all of our objects contain a sort of immediate, oh, that's exactly what happened next, and then additionally a ripple effect later in the story, which is less apparent. So I think to your point, there is a sort of trial and error, and part of our design is that we hope and intend for people to play through the game multiple times. Sort of the first time you go through getting the sort of, I can predict what the immediate effect is going to be thing, and then hopefully on the second or possibly third playthrough, understanding that there might be greater implications. And we think that's part of the joy of the game.
To follow up on that, actually, the other thing that we noticed was the idea that there's sort of an objective result. So, oh, look, in this drawer is a key. We unlocked the drawer. Here's a key. But there's this subjective information that's passed along to characters because of your decision. And what we found was it was kind of unsatisfying to the progression of the story if there wasn't a subjective tie-in. But it was really important that we made sure that there was a very physical, obvious ramification. So it wasn't just that there was an automatic result, it was an automatic physical result.
Lots of stuff we're going to talk about in our final presentation once we truly understand the ramifications of it all.
Yeah. Mike?
So it seems like you're signaling really strongly in Violet the things I can do. Is that something you arrived at based on playtesting?
Oh yeah, so we very early on, even before we were here, we were iterating on the story. We were working on it over the summer, and every single time we play tested, we asked, why did you make the decisions that you made about the objects? Did you feel, what did you think the impact of that choice was? And if there was either a misunderstanding of what the impact was, or it didn't matter at all, we would go back to the drawing board and say, what do we need to do differently?
In addition to that, in terms of how we determine the interactions, early on, one of our first builds had you able to pick up the phone and sort of wave it around in a more traditional sort of click and now I'm holding an object VR design that we've seen a lot of times. But because that didn't tie directly into the way that our narrative branched, it felt distracting, and so that's why we've limited in the ways that we did.
All right, thanks, Steve.
Thank you.